right, so you think when you have a 13-foot rod, typically the rods are longer, and this is up for debate, but people like the longer rods. I like them for casting because, like I said, the longer the rod you have, the more line you're able to let out, and the more momentum you're able to get with these casts. If you only had an 11-foot rod, you can't let as much line from the tip of your bobber down to your float, so you don't have as much momentum to stay in close quarters like this. So I really do like the 13-foot rod. It's the best all-around size in the industry. I would say if you're just starting out, 13-foot's the first one I would buy. And if you're buying your first rod ever, you don't want to spend a ton of money. The reels, you know what you want in a reel. You want a really strong clicker. You want something that's got really good startup. You want something that spins freely, really easily. I always like to find something that's got a nice rounded rim, so you got a lot of palming area and a lot of area to fight the fish. And what makes my reel special is I have these textured rims on there, and it's really great in wet conditions or rainy conditions. And it's one of those things you think, oh well, that's cool, but I don't fish much in the rain. You'd be surprised at how much I use this textured rim. So every time that I put an egg sack on and I wash my fingers off, or I release a fish, my hand's getting wet, and I'm out there and I need to retrieve, so I start having to bat the reel, and now my hand's connected to it. I'm not slipping all over it. So that's one of the reasons I think my reel is superior to most other people's. The other thing that I look for in reels is I really like to have feel to the reel, and what I mean by that is when that reel spins and when you're casting, it has a sound and a purr. Traditionally people think that because the reel needs to be free spinning, there should be no sound to the reel whatsoever, because sound indicates to people that there's drag. But that isn't true. When these reels are spinning, they're spinning on little tiny balls that are going around in a circle. And for a stainless steel reel, the really quiet bearings, you need to keep oil in those bearings to keep those balls spinning. Where with the ceramic bearings, there's no oil, no grease or anything needed, just the lubrication from the little stone ceramic rolls, and it's virtually a maintenance-free bearing. So that's why I like the ceramic, and like I was saying, I like the ceramic a lot because when you cast, you get a nice purr. You're not going to be able to hear it, I don't know if you guys heard that, but you get a nice purr, and when you're drifting, you get a lot of feedback. You get a little bit of this vibration that's telling you how fast your float is moving. And center pinning is very intimate. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. There's no drag. You're fighting the fish. It's all on you. You're applying what drag pressure you feel is necessary. You're also slowing your bobber down to what you feel like the speed should be during your drift. And so I'll say that, the best thing possible is something where it's sending another message. You're using another one of your senses, whether it's feel or sound, to really help you in that drift and that casting. So if you spin a reel and you're putting it up next to your ear and everything, that is telling you absolutely nothing. You're just telling you that your reel is quiet, doesn't give you anything with performance. So can't tell you how important it is to, when you spin your reel, to have some purr, because now you're able to feel it and now you're able to hear it, which is utilizing another one of your senses. With these cheaper, lighter reels, people have a really hard time casting them because the spool is so light. When you spin it, you can't feel anything at all. So what ends up happening is guys that are it's the worst thing you can do is start off with a really cheap reel, a $100 reel or a $40 reel or a $200 reel, because they're all going to have cheap stainless steel bearings in them. They're all going to be super duper light, and what's going to happen is you're not going to be able to load that thing properly or feel it or hear it, so you're going to have a hard time zipping that thing out there because there's no momentum of the spool because it's so light. So what I see a lot of people do is the only thing they can do, which is cast off the side like this, because that the reel doesn't spin, and you don't need to have a good bearing or good weight to cast off the side, and it develops a really bad habit. And I see people all the time make this mistake. They start off with a cheap reel and they gain all these bad habits, and then they go into a really nice reel like this, and now they bring the bad habits to this reel, and then they have to relearn how to cast the really nice reel all over again. So I can't stress enough, buy a good reel to start off, and buy a cheaper rod. Spend $70 to $200 on a starter rod just to see what you like. Once you see what you like, then you can invest more money in a better rod, whether it's a 12-footer or something that's really light or something that's got a lot of backbone. Blood Run Iridias, they make a 6 to 12 pound. That's the best overall rod if you want to fish everywhere in the country. And the Rain Shadow XST 1563. It's the rod that I use every day. And the Blood Run is a modified version of that 1563. So it comes with all the high frame 8s all the way out to the tip. Really good rod, but that's the top tier. If you want a really good rod that isn't too expensive, there's a Blood Run Skein Cane rod that's only $100, and then you have the Shimano Claris is around $100. It's not my favorite, but it's decent. And to be honest, there's the Riversider 13-footer. It's a 3-piece, but it's a really beautiful rod for $70 or $80. You can't beat one of those. What else? Anything you guys want to know about? Soft beads, pegging soft beads, jigs, when I like jigs.
Is it crucial to run like a smaller hook with a smaller bead? Like if you're running a 6mm soft bead, or
I would say yes. I do want a smaller hook with a smaller bead, because when you're going to a smaller bead, you're typically fishing in smaller water with more spooky fish. Sometimes not. Sometimes up in Michigan, those fish act so much like wild steelhead, like they're supposed to act. They don't really act like the Lake Ontario fish or the Lake Erie fish. There could be a steelhead and a coho spawning 10 foot down, and they're sitting behind picking out all these little 6mm or 8mm eggs. So you're fishing a big, swift, giant water with 6mm. You're just matching the hatch. You're dialing that in. But typically, so what I'm getting at is with the hook size, if you have too big of a hook under a small bead, that dampers the action of your bait. So now instead of having a really nice natural 6mm bead drift, if you put a size 4 hook under a 6mm bead, that's really weighting down that bead, and it's not super natural. And you don't really need to have one that's that big, a hook that's that big. I would typically, if I was running that, I'd run an 8 or a 10 if I'm running a 6. With soft beads, however, you could run a lot smaller of hooks. It was always the rule for years and years that if you're running hard beads, the bead should fit in the gap of the hook, right? That was always the rule. And I never followed that rule, and because I didn't follow that rule, my landing ratio was probably 30 or 40% with hard beads. When I moved to soft beads, because there's some give and some sponginess to the soft beads, and because the fish take them a lot better and hang on to them, they don't spit them instantly because they're a hard bead, my landing ratio went way, way up running the same size hooks. And like I was running soft beads the other day. I was running a 9mm soft bead, and I was running a size 8 hook, and it worked great together. Every time that float went down, because, like I said, because they're softer, they have a tendency to hold them on longer, and I'm not really snapping that rod right when that float goes down. When my float drops down on a bead drift, I just kind of lift up. I kind of feel like the fish is hooked, and then I pull up and drive it. And most of the time when I'm drifting, whether I'm drifting an egg sac or a bead, I'm pretty tight to my float the whole entire time. So my bobber's angled up, so a lot of times I feel that bite before my bobber even drops because I'm so tight to the drift. The only time I'm not tight to the drift is if I'm utilizing softer current in front of me to trot my float. And what I mean by that, this is going to sound really, this is hard to explain, but I'm going to do the best I can. But if you're fishing a fast seam in the middle of the river and you have a slower water moving in front of you, so let's say you have walking speed water in the middle and you have crawling speed water in tight, okay? Because it's faster going in the center of the run and it's slower in tight, if you just drop your rod tip down and you let your line catch in that slower water, it will start creating a loop in your line, and it will actually give you a natural trot anyways. So I try to explain this to people on the phone all the time, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. They say, oh, there's no upriver current or slow water in front of me, but there always is. There's always a fastest spot in the whole run. So I can't tell you how often I do this. When there's an area where you're making a really far, long drift and you need to trot your float, by holding your rod tip down low and letting the line start to bow out behind your float, you have a natural trot. So yeah, you have this bow in your line, but you utilize the water in front of you to trot your float properly. And it makes a ton of sense when you're making these long, hard drifts that you wouldn't be able to stay connected to your float a lot. And when I do that, typically when you're doing that, your tip is really close to the water because you need to create this bow. Every once in a while, I like to lift that bow of line off the water, mend my line over, reconnect to my float, and then let that bow start again. So my float's always trotting. And by doing that, where I'm not directly connected to my float, that float is really staying in that center seam really nicely for me. So I do that an awful lot. Like I can't stress it enough that you don't want to have your rod tip way up connected to your bobber, because the whole time you're putting tension on that float and you're pulling it out of the seam. So try to utilize what's in front of you. Utilize the currents that are moving a little slower, and or a current that's bringing up upriver a little bit. So if it's moving fast and here you have a small eddy in front of you, utilize that eddy to check your float for you. You always want your bobber angled upstream. That is the most important thing when you're fishing below you. If you're fishing above you towards a waterfall or something like that, then you want to modify your rig. You want to use, an inline weight, or you want to use you want a bulk shot or something like that. So what I mean by that is, if typically I'm using an accelerated shot pattern from heaviest to lightest, but if I'm fishing, somewhere where there's lots of boils or faster water, and I'm fishing towards a waterfall or a dam or a coffer, that inline weight, that would be right down here. And an inline weight, basically what you have is, if you have a 10-gram float, you'd have a 9-gram inline weight, and you'd have a few split shots to make up the gram of weight. So you have a lot of weight at your swivel here. So what happens is, that weight gets down real quick, and the bait kicks out in front. But what you end up having is you get this L shape where it comes down, and you have an L where it drops off like this. Okay, you don't have this nice angle like this. You have an L, and it's not nearly as effective of keeping your bait in the zone and jumping over rocks. That's really snaggy, but it's much more effective when you're casting upriver from you. Another great rig that a lot of people don't even know about, that I've just started experimenting with in the last year, is a Dropshot rig. And when people ask me about this and I start explaining it, they're like, oh, that's check nymphing. And it's absolutely not check nymphing. Check nymphing is a style of fly fishing where you have an anchor fly, and that anchor fly, you're bouncing bottom and you're ticking bottom, and you have a dropper fly above that anchor fly where that's usually what the fish bite. So that's 6 to 8 inches off the bottom, and it's right in the fish's face. It's a super effective fly fishing technique. But with the Dropshot rig, this is if I'm in a waterfall situation, or if I'm in a spot where I can't walk upstream. Anytime that I need to cast upriver from me, I like to run this Dropshot rig. And what the Dropshot rig is, I should have tied one up. I didn't even think I was going to explain this, so I'm not going to have this. But typically what I do for a Dropshot weight, or a Dropshot rig, is I'll run, let's say I'm running a 5-gram float. What I'll do is I'll run 3 grams of weight right below the bobber, and then I'll run 2 grams of weight at the very bottom of my fluorocarbon, and I'll have a swivel right here. So I have my main line, there's nothing on my main line except my bobber and a little bit of weight right below the float. And at the very bottom, and then I have my swivel, and at the very bottom of my rig I have a couple grams of split shot. Right above that I do a couple perfection loops or a couple dropper knots, and I drop a bead and a fly. And I'll tell you, I've been fishing all summer long with the little Pinland Centerpins, the 3-inch ones. I've been fishing this a lot, and it's really nice because if you got to cast up river from you, what's happening is you're pretty much your bobber's drifting down, and this weight at the bottom is just ticking the bottom. So you're able to connect to the bottom, and your two flies or your two beads or your egg sac and your jig, or you can't really
Welcome
use
to
it.
the Greater Niagara Fishing and Outdoor Expo. We have our door prize drawings for 10 a.m. and 11
Sorry,
a.m.
guys.
Chris Green from Lowbanks, Ontario, Canada. Chris Williams from Grand Island. Darren Baton from